Just a brief explanatory note before we get into the story here, which is really a fascinating story of the Old West. But part of it, the author wrote in the vernacular of what the mountain man would have sounded like in his communications and talking with other people. So that was a little bit difficult for me to read. And so I apologize in advance, but it's a good story, well worth taking a listen to if you enjoy the Old West. So away we go, as they say. Settlers loved him and called him a saint. The Indians named him Bloody Arm, but Jim Beckwourth, mountain man, trailblazer, man-killer, was especially noted for being the greatest horse thief of them all, and the biggest liar. Jim Beckwourth, Saint or Sinner, by Ed Earl Repp, was published in The West in March of 1969. Lacing the frowning scarps of the Rockies from the Cimarron to the Kennett Glaciers, the trails of the feuding fur brigade wove through the high country like a spider web from scattered outposts along the white-capped rivers. Trails that were stained with the blood of trappers and mountain men who served such bee-propelled legions as the Hudson's Bay Company, William Henry Ashley's Missouri Fur Company, the American Fur Company of John Jacob Astor, and many others. From the muddy Missouri to the crystal Sacramento, they ranged predacious, robbing, killing each other for the furry riches inhabiting the numerous streams. They planted the stars and stripes wherever they went, and maintained it with the hot barrel of their Hawkins rifle. It was a hard existence along these wilderness roads, and some men grew old and died in a single year working the beaver colonies. Only link steel and whang leather veterans could survive the hardships of killing blizzards and freezes almost unimaginable, bull bolts and flash floods too. They faced a constant threat of hostile Arapaho, Gross, Ventry, Sioux, Cheyenne, Kiowa, Nez Perce, and Apache Indians. West of the Rockies, they were confronted by the deadly Modocs, Shoshone, Paiutes, Washos, and the Mohawks. Gold had not yet been discovered in California. Beaver was the king, the fur trade the lure of the day. Among those who survived the fur trade was James P. Beckwourth. Now, Jim Beckwourth was a freebooter, a horse thief par excellence, a squaw man, a chief of the Crows, and high in the councils of the Buckskin Brotherhood, holding rendezvous at St. Brian's, Bent's Fort Taos, Fort Laramie, and Leavenworth, Pitt River, and Old Shasta. Spaniards called him a killer. Settlers referred to him as a saint. He survived where the death rate among the trapper fraternity frequently exceeded 70%. For half a century, he lived throughout the raw, bloody frontiers, embracing that tremendous territory beyond the Mississippi, known as the Great Unexplored West. Pathfinders like Colonel William Bent of Bent's Fort on the Jornado del Muret, Jeb Smith, Kit Carson, Jim Bridger, Lanky Bill Williams, Gaston Charbonneau, and John C. Fremont all attested in voice and diary to Jim Beckwourth's loyalty, rough vitality, stamina, and utter fearlessness, notwithstanding his capacity to empty a gallon jug of bust head at a single sitting. And the 1844 Spanish Californios bore witness to his uncanny skill at rustling when he stole 3,000 head of fine horses, many belonging to Governor Macatora and Mexican dictator General Santa Anna, then preparing to protect California from the Americanos of John Sutter's Legion of Riflemen. In 1846, he escaped again with 1,800 more horses and mules. Sans bill of sale, he drove them to Colorado at a neat profit. A former blacksmith and wearing an upper set of cast-iron dentures of his own forging, Beckwourth was known as a man to conjure with. 6'4" in moccasin feet, built like a wedge, he was born in Fredericksburg, Virginia, in 1798. He was the son of a plantation overseer and a quadroon woman. In 1805, he was taken to Cape Girardeau, and when big enough, he was apprenticed to the blacksmith named Kasner in St. Louis. Learning the trade, Jim, at about 19, determinedly shook free of the apprenticeship. He signed on with the William Henry Ashley in 1823 for trapline work, a raw recruit in the buckskin war between Missouri Fur Company and the Hudson's Bay Company for the rich beaver streams of the Rockies and beyond. When Ashley sold out to Jackson, Smith and sublet 3 years later, Jim Beckwourth was no longer a tenderfoot on the fur trails. He was equal, if not better, of such seasoned veterans as Jim Bridger, Jedediah Smith, Hugh Glass, Old Greenwood, Bill Williams, Pegleg Smith, and the others of the long-hair legions. He was his own master, and his movements were dictated by the existing phrase, "which way the wind blows." His dark glittering eyes looked toward the Sparrowhawk people of the Powder River country. Just what lured him there is not verified, but he packed his traps and possibles on a horse, threw his huge hulk onto the saddle, and cut stick for the Powder River. Beckwourth's white and mulatto blood and superb physique gave him the appearance of a perfect, even handsome Indian. At times, he passed himself off as one, on occasion infiltrating enemy bands to spread havoc within their ranks, creating confusion among them to rescue a friend or count coup with the scalps of some unfortunate braves. One thing is sure, Jim Beckwourth could be as gentle and affectionate as a hearth-trained dog, or as mean and nasty and cruel as a bloodthirsty Apache. Ample witnesses of his kindness and geniality is offered in an account by Ina Coolbrith, the famous poetess of the 1890s. When a girl, she and her family were members of a lost wagon train, hungry, sick, discouraged, and fearful of hostile Indians dogging them. The wagons had finally circled to fend off an expected attack. Ill with fever, Miss Coolbrith lay in her wagon listening to the men outside discussing the impending attack. Just when it was about to begin, Jim Beckwourth, known as Chief Bloody Arm of the Crows, rode calmly into the circle. Miss Coolbrith reveals that the attackers simply melted away as mysteriously as was Beckwourth's sudden appearance. He slid from his mount and took quick note of the starving conditions of the immigrants. Pity clouded his dark eyes. He shook his leonine head sympathetically. Grimly, he cut some pack thongs and dumped the carcass of an antelope for the train women to prepare. He was garbed in fringed buckskins, many beads, and had long black hair falling to his shoulder length. A single eagle feather was braided into the locks hanging behind a beaverskin cap. From his saddle pouches, he took a bag of candy and distributed it among the children. Where he came by the candy in the wilderness was not recorded. When he reached Ina Coolbrith and her younger brother, there were tears of pity in his clouded eyes. To them, and all the rest of the miserable train, he appeared as their savior, a living saint who came boldly out of nowhere bearing gifts of sweets and food. While Indian herbs were being administered to the sick, Jim Beckwourth, who was to shoot and slit the throats of a dozen white men, held council with the train elders. What developed gives considerable credibility to his frequent disputed claims of having been the first to cut a trail through the high Sierras known today as Beckwourth Pass, now a high-speed concrete ribbon Highway 70 from Sacramento Valley to Reno, Nevada. Beckwourth intimated that he had pioneered a road into California on a scouting trip for the beaver, which were numerous in the Sacramento River, the Feather, American, and Butte Sink, just east of the present-day Chico. As a result of his discoveries, he could and did lead the Coolbrith train out of its lost situation over the Sierras and through his pass to Spanish Valley, now Plumas County, California, emerging at Bidwell Bar on the Feather. He hinted he had helped take some 50 pieces of prime beaver blue from Sacramento Valley for the Ashley Company between 1823 and 1826, long before gold was discovered at Coloma. Although his tales frequently stretch the truth, the fact that he led the Coolbrith train safely to California lends credence to his claims. Informatively, however, a piece of fur represented a pack weighing 50 pounds. Beaver were still numerous in the region despite the heavy trapping of Hudson's Bay, Ogden, Sublet, and others who were engaged in the fur trade. Beckwourth went on to explain how he earned the sobriquet of Bloody Arm from the Crows. Jim Bridger, his equal at prevarication, who wandered into the Coldbreath camp one stormy night, listened as he told of killing the biggest, meanest he-grizzly ever encountered in the high Sierras, or anywhere else for that matter. I tells you, Bridger, Beckwourth elucidated with an air of truth, that bar was the biggest, nastiest, killingest critter I'd ever seen. Some Injun varmints druv him into a cave up yonder and was scared to go in arter him. Them varmints give me a choice of going in myself or losing my hair. No bar ever scared me more in being scalped. So I wraps my blanket around my left arm and peasers into that cave where the bar war Wallace, the grizzly, he had are sticking out his jowls, came charging many pronto. My butcher knife just bent double against his brisket, and I was plumb unarmed. That was a fight I'd hunker through to forget, but look at the scars. That was written weird, so I'm sorry for the somewhat mispronunciations. Beckwourth's torso glistened in the rain and firelight. Long, livid blue welts crisscrossed his chest and shoulders. A torn ligament in his left biceps made his arm stiff, somewhat at the elbow. Jim Bridger, master of tall tales, was goggle-eyed at Beckwourth as he went on. That bar had fangs long as a plowshare, and his claws was like the spokes of a wagon wheel sharpened to points. I sped right off. I was as close to the happy hunting ground as an Injun ever gets thought going over hump. The bar got me down. He choused open his jaws to crunch my hide like a blackberry. It was then I drove my fist down his throat. It was him chawing flesh all the while until my arm was a bloody hunk of buffler liver. I couldn't let go. He couldn't either. So I just drove down deeper until I catched a hold of his tonsils. He got kind of sick and then started retching and convulsing about the catamount with a foot in one trap. Folks, that bar plumb killed himself with me holting onto his tonsils for dear life, whilst he turned himself plumb inside out from snoot to tail, all 1,400 pounds of him. That's the gospel. He dangled a buckskin medicine pouch for all to see. Inside were the fangs of the grizzly, the largest even Jim Bridger had ever beheld. For once the dour mountain man was stumped for a wilder story of his own. He knew if Beckwourth was not lying outright, he was certainly stretching the truth to the limit. That bit of Jim Beckwourth reminiscence occurred just west of today's town of Beckwourth on Upper Highway 70. There he later built a log cabin that served as his trading post and hotel, and from where he collected tolls for the use of his trail. It still stands after more than a century. When aroused, Jim Bridger was as vicious and venomous a fighter as he was at rare times warm-hearted and gentle. Raw evidence of his savagery is evidenced by his cold-blooded killing of some alleged renegades that he had tracked down for the administration of his own mountain man brand of justice. Following the safe delivery of the Coldbreath and several other wagon trains through Marysville, California via the Beckwourth Pass, Jim hired out as a courier from Monterey to various points northward, including the mission San Miguel, which was in charge of a Mr. Reed, a kindly Englishman who had befriended him on many occasions. That Jim returned the affection is proven by the fact that he always stopped there at night, when possible, to visit with Reed and his delightful family. Still in the tenderfoot or greenhorn stage of frontier existence, Reed was a tolerant, trusting gentleman of mild emotions and zealous hospitality. On this particular evening, Jim arrived at the mission at dusk, received no answer to his gun-butt knock, and shoved his way inside. William T. Talbitzer, historian, author, and newspaper correspondent of Oroville, wrote a report of what Beckwourth found inside. Reed lay dead on the floor of his kitchen in a pool of his own blood. Further search revealed Mrs. Reed dead in a passageway in another room. He found the body of her domestic, an Indian woman whose throat had been cut. Jim was about to enter another room when instinct halted him. His sharp ears heard muffled breathing, and his scented strong tobacco with the reeds did not use. His senses, sharpened by years on the fur trail and Indian warpaths, told him the killers were hiding in the room with pistols aimed at the door. He realized he would be a dead man the moment he opened it. His 6'4" hulk with moccasined feet made no sound as he backed away. How many men were in the room he did not know. There could have been 1 or a score. He had seen no horses outside, but guessed that they were hidden in the scrub oak thickets behind the mission. Outside, he cat-footed his horse some distance away before mounting, then cut stick for the Denny Ranch, a distance of 24 miles. There he enlisted the help of Mexican vaqueros and Indian hands and returned at once to the mission. Altogether, they found 11 bodies throughout the building, including the entire Reed family, a brood of several children and mission Indians. An attempt had been made to burn the building, but the fire had gutted out, leaving grisly evidence of the wanton massacre. Jim knew Reed had little money, that he was a remittance man living on a small allowance from home in England. He interspersed his investigation of the crime with the occasional gusty "wog," and all the while his latent savage temper was mounting. There were many signs that he could read. Closets had been rifled, chests overturned in a methodical search for money. A dragging spur roll here, the scuff of an iron boot heel there, told Jim Beckwourth white men had committed the crime. It was difficult to number the killers involved. A half-dozen glass tumblers set on the kitchen table, the dregs of wine-drinking boat still moist in their bottoms. The empty bottles indicated at least 10 men were involved. In a corner he found a silver spangle accidentally ripped from a man's pantaloons, and he came to one conclusion: Mexicans. Dawn was tinting the skies like a crimson halo over the Sierras when the burials were complete. Dividing his companions into groups, Jim set out with 5 vaqueros. The trail was picked up behind the mission. Jim Beckwourth reverted to Indian cunning. As a tracker and scout, Fremont once remarked Beckwourth was without peer. Finally, he came upon a group of men in a breakfast camp, 14 in all. 6 were Mexican, 2 Indians, and 1 bred, and 5 were gringos. All, he summed up, the scum of the gold diggings. Leaving his companions hidden in the thicket, he strolled boldly into the camp. His piercing black eyes flicked on every detail of the group. The bay horse just beyond had belonged to Reed. The Mexican leaning over the fire had lost his spangle from his ornate pantaloons. There were bloodstains on the vest of the tall, cadaverous man who remained aloof from the others. Jim chose him as the leader. Records identify him as a man known only as Dempsey, but it was all Jim Beckwourth needed. At a signal, his men in the thicket opened fire. With a hair-raising war cry, Jim snatched out his knife and leaped at Dempsey. That worthy's gun was scarcely out of its pouch when Jim's butcher knife opened his throat. Caught in the fire of the hidden riflemen, the renegades fell like 10 pins around Beckwourth as he hurled himself at the remaining whites. His curdling war whoops quivered among the trees, overawing his adversaries. The slashing blade cut them to ribbons. The others threw down their guns, and all were badly wounded or dead. Beckwourth had taken it for granted that all in the camp had participated in the Reed massacre. However, there are conflicting reports, and repercussions followed. One of the wounded confessed that while the gang had robbed and killed the Reeds for a $1,000 poke of dust a miner had left with them for safekeeping, not all had participated. Rumors began circulating that murder charges were to be filed against Beckwourth in San Luis Obispo. He had gotten his revenge, killing 7 of the 14 raiders himself, taking the law into his own hands. Of course, he had misgivings, realizing that in his fury he could have killed innocent men. For once, Jim Beckwourth was worried. He faced a murder rap that could have meant hanging, and without waiting to find out, he cut stick for the tall mountains, avoiding even his own pass. Wagon trains were pouring over it to its terminus in Marysville. He had no desire to be seen or tracked. Once more he was in his own element, the mountainous wilderness. Game was plentiful. His diet consisted of venison liver and the succulent beaver tail stew, Indian onions, and wild tubers. Then one night, as he lay in his blanket on the eastern slopes of the Sierras, he awoke with a severe abdominal pain. For once in his life, he knew he was a very sick man. He became half-crazed, insensible to realities, forgetting even his mount and pack animal. On hands and knees, he crawled down the mountain, emerging on the bank of the Truckee River in Nevada, where he collapsed. A small train of 17 wagons subsequently entered into a nearby meadow and made camp at what is known today as Glendale Bridge. Scouting for the train was Pegleg Smith. Roasting up firewood, the grizzled mountain man stumbled on his old friend Beckwourth, more dead than alive, lying half in and half out of the cooling river. His lusty walk brought him help from the others. Soon Jim Beckwourth was in the hands of a competent pioneer woman. Said Smith tersely, "Thar war actin' like a prairie dog that had just swallered a live scorpion. Ye can take my har for prime plue, and if it ain't old Jim Beckwourth, ailin' just like a dog a coughing up fish bones. Old Jim is ailin' mighty hard, folks." Jim Beckwourth was down with his scourge of the fur trails. The kindly woman went to work on him, and Smith came up with the Indian remedy for the wilderness. Anxious to be on their way west for California, some of the men in the train grew ugly at the delay, whilst them fool women fuss over and run the mill nigger. Pegleg's hawk and rifle but knocked out a few teeth. Nigger hell, the man was Jim Beckwourth, one of the closest friends, worth 100 such goddamn outfits like this fleabag train. Moreover, said train was froze in its tracks until he recovered, or counted coup with the devil himself. Smith's ultimatum stuck. Without his knowledge of the Sierras, the train couldn't move an inch. Beckwourth raved for a week like a prairie dog that had swallowed a live scorpion, and then suddenly emerged from the darkness. His black eyes centered on Pegleg Smith, whom he hadn't seen in years. Then he was on his feet with a bounding leap, the pair of bear-hugging, shouting greetings mixed with appropriate profanity until the Truckee resounded with their thunderous shouts of glee. "I smell victuals," Beckwourth roared. "My belly is so empty my gallstones is rattling. I'm honin' for a go at buffler tripe, and snatch me bald if'n that ain't what I smell." It was from a barrel of brine. All knew Jim Beckwourth was ready for the trail. No time was lost. He would have it no other way than to lead the 17 wagons to the entrance of Beckwourth Pass, and from there on the party was on its own. Smith tracked down his saddle mount and pack animal, where in his illness Beckwourth had abandoned them in a tight little meadow lush with sweet mountain grass. As for Beckwourth, California was too hot for him now. He yearned for other climes, remarking to Pegleg, "Prime Plue, a pretty gal, and a few pesos to jingle is salve for any man's fixins." Smith gave him a jug of snakehead whiskey, then took the little train to Marysville. Jim might have had a moment of loneliness as regards the female sex. It is on record that he had several Indian wives. Some of his offspring were Crow warriors. It is known he had a number of other bouts with domesticity, specifically Senorita Luisa Sandville, whom he actually wed at Taos, New Mexico, at the age of 43. He tried business, and it paled him. Living in a house with windows and doors was beyond his capacity. He remarked it was like living in a pine-board box 6 feet under the ground. Discouraged at his inability to adapt himself to civilization, he packed his possibles on his saddle cantle and moved on. At the junction of Fountain Creek and the Arkansas, he made camp, which was to become what is known as Pueblo, Colorado today. While taking beaver plue, he did not know that untold wealth and rich coal lay everywhere around him. In 1842, he hunted meat for Bent's Fort. His next stop was the Cache la Padre, which adjoins Greeley now. There he traded with the St. Vrain brothers and again met John C. Fremont. Fremont promptly invited him to join his party as guide and scout, along with Kit Carson and Lucine Maxwell. Fremont of South Carolina drew no color lines here. He dairy mentions that Jim Beckwourth mixed a fine julep of wild mint. It was inevitable that Jim and his wife, the Senora Luisa, were destined to formal and complete separation because of his failure to domesticate. It was just not in the cards for Jim Beckwourth to be a family man. The mountains and prairies always beckoned, and what lay beyond was an irresistible lure. Although a deeply sensitive man, he must have had little misgivings over the marital wreckage, for he headed once again toward the Crow Nation. Once more, he became Bloody Arm, chief of the Crows. Some historians claim it was a self-imposed title, that he was merely a sub-chief. The fact remains that he took up with a Blackfeet Indian girl named Pine Leaf, and then led the Crows in a tribal war against her people, the Cheyennes and the Sioux. He was usually seen in the company of Longhair, who succeeded Rotten Belly, recognized Crow Chief, and the co-chief title is possibly true. The tribal wars decimated many of the opposing factions, and Jim turned his attention to the crooked traders who were endeavoring to sustain the feuds at great profit to themselves with guns, powder, and ball, and worst of all, whiskey. While he loved his bottle or jug, he despised the traders for the way they cheated his red brothers. He knew what the white man's poison did to them and what they would do to obtain it. They would murder their own children for 1 gallon of trade whiskey, watered down with 4 gallons of sometimes foully contaminated water. 5 barrels of whiskey made 1,600 pints of trade stuff. For each pint, the trader charged 1 buffalo rope valued at $5 on the market. That amounted to a profit of $6,000 for 60 gallons of whiskey containing devastating quantities of methyl alcohol or wood spirits. Beckwourth sought out the most vicious of the traders doing business with the Crows and summarily shot them to death. Not a crusader by any stretch of the imagination, he made it known that trading whiskey to the Crows would result in swift retaliation. As the ultimatum spread, the whiskey trade all but vanished in the Crow Nation, resulting in longer periods of peace with the neighboring tribes. But the traders were not the kind to accept Beckwourth's ultimatum lying down. By now, the Crows were traded practically out of their pants. Not adverse to making a profit himself at times, Jim saw them shivering in their teepees, having traded away their robes and blankets for rot-gut booze following a slow, almost unproductive buffalo hunting season. He made a trip to the trading post at Pueblo and returned with a pack train laden with blankets, and these he distributed among the Crows with the understanding they would be paid for in buffalo robes after the next season's hunt. There is no record of the traders contaminating the blankets, but it was more than coincidence that a smallpox epidemic then struck the Crows and other nations with such devastating effect that 17,200 redskins bit the dust. Some figures raise as high as 150,000, including Crows, Mandans, Sioux, Blackfeet, Anasaboines, Iraqis, and Meritrees, and to Jim Beckwourth went the blame. It also alerted the balance of power among the Indians and introduced such warriors as Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, Red Cloud, Tall Bull, Gall, Dull Knife, and a host of others who were to become the bulwark of opposition to white expansion into the West. Some historians disagree as to the degree or even the label of guilt. What was his motivation? Would he act with human viciousness for no reason? Some claim that the elements of tribes he had helped the Crows defeat had somehow infected the blankets in revenge. Others claimed that certain mountain men of the fur trails, with a grudge against Beckwourth, had engineered the murderous slaughter to place the blame upon him. It is believed the truth of the matter lay in the hands of the disenchanted traders. As far as is known, the incident has never been settled, one way or the other, but the effect is of record. Burial platforms sprang up over the prairies like fast-growing weeds. The lament of the surviving squaws was like the low moan of the wind over the land with its smell of death. Jim Beckwourth moved on once more. It was that of having his scalp dangling from the stick over a smoke fire. He could not buck the entire Indian nation, and he cut stick for California once again. And now it was the United States soil, and Jim swore off horse stealing. Where it had once been virtually safe to raid the ranchos of the Californios, American justice now applied, and Beckwourth, who had successfully uncoiled his long loop and unsheathed his razor-sharp butcher knife against the Reed family killers, no longer had to fear Mexican law. A new day, and apparently clean slate, was fate's gift to him. The gold rush by this time was in full swing. California had gone crazy with gold fever. But Jim felt there were easier ways of making a living than hard scrambling for the elusive will-o'-the-wisp. He handed in Sonora and went into the saloon with apparel business. One of his customers was none other than Joaquin Morita, who was to become California's bloodiest bandit. Morita had just arrived and had set up the Blue Tent gambling cantina. The town was bursting at the seams with gold seekers, tin horns, prostitutes, freighters, and the riffraff of the globe. Jim prospered, but men coming in with jack trains laden with gold dust and nuggets changed his thinking. Then a man named Stoddart, later called Crazy Stoddart, hit town with a pocket full of egg-sized nuggets. Jim succumbed to the gold fever, and with a host of other wild-eyed believers, followed Stoddart back to find a mythical gold lake from which the huge nuggets had been taken, according to Mr. Stoddart. Stoddart was unable to retrace his trail to the lake of gold, and men still look for it today. Jim Beckwourth quit, tried Rich Bar, and quit again. Like so many other gold seekers, he was among the unlucky. Men found riches all around him, but Jim was on the fringe. With the profit from the sale of his Sonora business, he returned to the beloved Beckwourth Pass, made extensive improvements in the road, and settled down to collecting tolls for its use by pioneers, freighters, and prospectors. The community of Beckwourth Village grew about the sturdy log cabin he built, and then a fire wiped out the town. Only the cabin itself remained. By now, the years were laying a frosty tint on his black hair. He felt the pangs of arthritis striking at the joints of his gnarled hands. The strong wang leather legs that had once carried him up a mountainside at a steady lope now dragged a little. His blacksmith's dentures hurt when he bit into strips of venison jerky. He had to forego that for the softer beaver tail stews. Buffalo tripe was not available here in the Sierras, and he considered it too rubbery now anyhow. The winter of 1854 and 55 was the worst he had ever experienced. Many men struck his door with fingers and toes black from frostbite, ears that virtually sloughed off the head, noses bulbous and covered with hoarfrost. He helped them all, and he buried many on the hillside above the cabin in the spring when the ground had thawed and the cadavers could be removed from the melting snowpack. The hard winter and the creak of his bones decided for him. Again he packed up his possibles and cut stick, this time heading out for New Mexico, where he thawed out in the warm, comforting sun of Santa Fe and Taos. Much of his movement then is cloaked in mystery, especially his trips to St. Louis in 1857 and 1858. A gap exists between those dates in 1859 when he rode into Denver. Perhaps he was engaged in another courtship, for in 1860 another lady abruptly appeared in his life, Miss Elizabeth Letbetter, whom he married, but again domesticity paled on him. He went off once more to the beaver streams along the South Platte. Nothing is known of Elizabeth's reactions. He returned to Denver in 1864 and was on the receiving end of an insult from a gunslinging tough man named Nigger Bill. Beckwourth had no qualms about promptly killing the man, and the Denver press reported to his acquittal on a self-defense plea. At 66, Jim Beckwourth was still a man to conjure with. He had scarcely unpacked his possibles when he loaded them once again on his pack animal and rode away into the Buffalo Wallowed Wind, or Wind River country. He never returned. There remain conflicting reports. One has it he died in the saddle at old age. Another claims that his old friends, the Crows, had poisoned him to avenge the epidemic they believed he had visited upon them. No thanks is mentioned for the many blankets he gave them to save their lives. Still, another report has it that enemies among the traders murdered him. One fact remains that many burial platforms and their dead have long since gone to dust, even as Jim Beckwourth himself. It may never be known just how many or when the final curtain dropped for him.